Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fulbright Virtual Speaker Series. I am Ángeles Vaquerizo, a Fulbright alumni from Spain, living in California, and a board member of the San Diego chapter of the Fulbright Association. I am a transplant surgeon at Scripps Green Hospital in San Diego and the CEO and founder of MedUpSAB. And I'm going to be your host today. Before we start, I want to share with you a few housekeeping issues. The webinar will be recorded and available in a few days, and you're muted, but you can use the Q&A feature to ask questions that we will answer at the end of the presentation. Over the last year, the COVID pandemic has significantly impacted every corner of the globe and has affected people's mental and physical well-being. How we handle these hardships and challenges will allow us to bounce back and overcome the setbacks in the most effective way possible. Our Fulbright Speaker Series brings a great opportunity to learn from Dr. Bryce Carlson, who will share his personal journey that has taken him from a research career in nutrition and human evolution with a side interest in endurance sport to his personal and professional exploration of how we adapt to significant environmental stress. He poses the question, what are the limits of human endurance? Bryce is a Guinness World Record holder, a scientist, educator, coach, an ultra-endurance athlete with over 15 years of experience in education and adventure around the world. He studied the dietary environment of wild chimpanzees in Sub-Saharan Africa as assistant professor of anthropology at Purdue University and applied those insights into the study of human evolution. As of 2021, Carlson has completed more than 150 marathons and 25 ultramarathons, including a 3,100-mile stage race from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., and a world record-breaking solo and supported row across the North Atlantic Ocean. We are so grateful to have him join us today for our Fulbright Speaker Series presenting the Adventure and Adaptation, a goal-oriented journey toward resilience through stress. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Bryce Carlson. Bryce, we are delighted to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us, and the virtual stage is all yours.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, thank you so much for that wonderful and warm introduction. I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to be here with you all today. A little bit, thought we'd start with just kind of an outline of where I plan to go. So I thought I would start by talking a little bit about how I came to be interested in adventure and adaptation. So a look at my previous research career looking at nutrition and human evolution as a gateway to looking at adventure and adaptation. I'll talk primarily about two big adventures that I've undertaken over the last 6 years and some of the science that we've been able to work through in association with those adventures. And then I'll wrap up just by talking a little bit about some lessons, largely anecdotal, learned along the way about resilience and how we approach unknown unknowns. So my academic training is formally in nutrition science and biological anthropology. And my interests really started at the intersection between nutrition and human evolution. We know that starting around 2 million years ago, our ancestors' brains began undergoing a threefold expansion, leading to present day. And I had a lot of questions about how nutrition may have played a role at that key evolutionary transition. We needed to ask two kind of fundamental questions with respect to how to build a big brain. In order to build a big brain, we first have to remove any evolutionary constraints that may be inhibiting the expansion of that brain. And then once those constraints are removed, we then need to think about what selective pressures may be present driving the evolution of a large brain. So with respect to constraints, one of the first and perhaps biggest ideas in the role of constraints on brain evolution was that proposed by Aiello and Wheeler in 1995, and that's the expensive tissue hypothesis. They posited that of all the organs and organ systems in our body, some are metabolically more expensive than others. They burn more energy per unit mass than others, the brain being one of them. And so if we are going to expand the size of one of these metabolically expensive organs, we either would expect the overall metabolic rate of the organism is going to increase, or there needs to be some kind of trade-off. And with humans, we see that humans have a basal metabolic rate that is approximately equivalent to what we would expect for an organism, or especially a primate of our body size. So we don't see that increase in overall metabolic rate. So Aiello and Wheeler suggested that there must be a trade-off. And when they looked at the observed mass of our various organs, metabolically expensive organs, relative to the size we would expect for a primate of our particular body size, they noticed that our brains are much bigger than we would expect, but our gut, our overall gut mass, is much smaller than we would expect. And so they proposed that there was this metabolic trade-off, that in order for human brain size to expand, the size of our gut must have shrunk, and that may have been a key constraint on the evolution of the human brain. So once that constraint is lifted, then we have to think about what was the selection pressure driving the expansion of the human brain. And that's where one particular hypothesis, called the ecological intelligence hypothesis, posited that greater cognition, brain power, was required to forage or hunt for hard to find and processed foods. With respect to humans in particular, we noted that you have to know which species are edible, of plants or animals, where you can find them, remember where you last visited and what may have been ripe or unripe at that time. So foods that are hard to access or find, or foods that are hard to process, they require special techniques that may require advanced cognitive skills, and that may have been the underlying selective pressure for bigger brains. And the more I explored the role nutrition played in the evolution of our lineage, the more interested I became in the mechanisms of adaptation more generally. How do organisms adapt to environmental challenges? How does that process look in real time? How does that process look over the course of a lifetime, or over generations or millennia? At the same time, in my personal life, I had run a number of marathons and begun exploring this unknown world of ultramarathon running. So these are events that traditionally begin at the 50-kilometer distance, which is about 5 miles further than a traditional marathon. And they extend really to the horizon with distances almost beyond imagination. So I began my exploration with a local 50-kilometer trail race and really was hooked from the first. At the finish of that race, I was treated to stories from a variety of runners of all ages describing incredible experiences at other races they'd completed at the 50-mile or 100-mile distances. I couldn't wrap my head around running for 100 miles, and their stories were truly inspiring. So those stories really began kind of an itch that kicked off several years of pushing distances and challenges with ratcheting levels of stress. From the highly rocky and technical trails of the Superior Sawtooth 100-mile, pictured on the left here in northern Minnesota, to the relentless demands of running several 100-mile races in a single summer, pictured in the middle here, the Midwest Ultra Grand Slam, or running one of the hardest and most competitive ultramarathons on the planet, the 153-mile Spartathlon in Greece, pictured on the right. The more I ran, the more parallels I observed between the kind of goal-driven, purposeful adaptation I was going through personally, preparing for each new race, and the adaptations that species must experience over generations. So I became interested in adaptation more broadly and at various scales of time, and wondered whether we could study the processes of adaptation in living populations undergoing stress, whether we could understand evolution in deep time. It seemed fruitful to form a better understanding of how organisms adapt in real time to significant environmental stresses. And ultra endurance athletes seem to provide that avenue, right? Ultra endurance athletes routinely explore and seek to defy or expand human physiological and psychological limitations. Here, this is a relatively simple diagram that effectively models in a very simplistic way how I think about stress and adaptation, right? That the organism is normally in a happy state, a homeostatic state, experiences some kind of stress that takes the organism out of homeostasis, and then through a number of biological processes, they adapt to those stresses and return to that homeostatic state. Nutrition, technology, and behavior all intersect our relationship with environmental stress and our need and ability to adapt to them. They may buffer us from environmental stresses, and they may also facilitate adaptation to them. So for example, we may use air conditioning to buffer ourselves from midsummer heat, or we may utilize sports nutrition products to facilitate recovery from a weightlifting session. So in August 2013, I heard rumors that a new race was being organized that would stretch the limits of human endurance and provide a potentially fruitful venue to explore adaptation in real time. The race across USA was a 3,100-mile foot race organized as a series of daily stages, each approximately a marathon in length. The format would loosely follow the legendary Bunyan Derbies of the 1920s, running from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. and the Atlantic coast just beyond. As a runner, I was personally drawn to compete in the race and to embody the stress and gain a firsthand perspective on what that felt like. As an academic, I was also tickled by the opportunity to study the stress of running ultra long distances affecting the body and how the runners consciously and unconsciously adapted. And so I reached out to the race director, applied to join the race as a runner, and after a number of conversations with the race director, was appointed the research director for the effort as well. Some initial brainstorming identified key questions of adaptation and energetics, the cardiovascular system, biomechanics, nutrition, the microbiome, epigenetics, and psychology. I then reached out to a number of academic colleagues who published in these areas and initially found a lot of interest from them. Ultimately, however, funding and availability and timing limited us to three key areas of inquiry, that being energetics, cardiovascular, adaptations, and biomechanics. Each runner's preparations leading up to that 3,100-mile run were variable, but we all knew about 1 year in advance of the start, and most of us began preparing right away. My own training included building up to very high mileage weeks of training, and I included two big races in that year leading up. The first in May, so about 9 months before the race would begin, and the second in September, about 4 months before the race would begin. The first race was a very hot race down in the Florida Keys of 100 miles in duration. The second race being the Spartathlon in Greece. Both races were ultra long distance. They were held on roads and in hot climates. And I knew adequate preparation for these two big races would parallel preparation for the race across USA and allow me to gauge my progress towards being sufficiently adapted to embrace and embody that stress. As we got started, or I should say right before we got started on the run, we collected a variety of baseline data at UCLA in Los Angeles. So all runners were provided a doubly labeled sample of water, which we would use to analyze metabolic rate. Blood was drawn, hearts were scanned, running biomechanics were measured, stools were collected. We took every runner's weight and body fat percentage, and provided every runner a psychological survey to get some baseline data of where we stood before the route began. A subsequent series of follow-up data was then collected en route throughout the race. Our daily routine throughout the race across USA included rising at around 6:30 in the morning, fixing a quick breakfast and some instant coffee. We would then break camp, which often meant breaking down tents and packing everything back up, loading our support vehicles with all of our equipment, and then traveling via support vehicle to wherever we'd finished the previous day's run. At 8:00 a.m., we'd begin running a set course of somewhere between 26 and 32 miles for the day, with water provided every 6 to 7 miles by our support crew and by our research assistants. We'd finish running between around 12 noon and 3 o'clock, depending on speed. Each day, each stage was considered a race, and every runner incentivized to run that stage as fast as possible, really without inhibiting their ability to do the same the next day. So runners would finish between 12 noon and 3 o'clock, then travel to the site of our accommodations for the night, maybe set up a tent, set up a sleeping bag, a sleeping mat, etc. And then begin a series of active recovery strategies until bedtime, which would be around 9 o'clock. Most nights we camped out in parks or on the gym floors of schools, community centers, or churches. Air-conditioned hotels were a rare treat, and we felt incredibly spoiled when we got to indulge. We ate a lot throughout the race across USA and indulged in a lot of milkshakes. Milkshakes seemed to be the team favorite. Weather presented a wide variety of challenges, from sun exposure in the Mojave Desert in California to altitude and snow in New Mexico, ice storms in western Texas, and oppressive humidity in Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. But we also engaged in a lot of playful shenanigans along the way. Pictured here on the right, you can see that's me hanging off of the upper turn 1 at Talladega Super Speedway. We were allowed onto the course kind of miraculously through some connections that someone had. I don't even remember how, but I do remember that as an incredibly valuable and interesting and uplifting experience. So we experienced a variety of manifestations of stress over the course of the race. In the first 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks of the race were really categorized by a true embodiment of stress. The inflammation was high, joint pain was high. A number of the runners experienced blisters that had to be managed on a daily basis. By weeks 3 and 4, however, our bodies seemed to be recovering and fully absorbing the stress and adapting to the daily stresses. Weeks 3 and 4 also saw significant routine building, where a lot of us felt like those second 2 weeks, 3 and 4, were really defined by kind of mentally getting our head into a routine and a pattern of behavior that allowed us to run fast, not just long on any given day, and get up the next day and do the same. Active recovery strategies throughout these periods included prodigious use of foam rollers, extra sleep, so naps during the day, self-massage, carefully timed nutrition to optimize glycogen replacement, sufficient protein intake to facilitate recovery, anti-inflammatory foods, rich in antioxidants and other phytonutrients, and of course using standard kind of rice strategy, using ice, compression, elevation to help fight inflammation. And I can say with at least some anecdotal confidence that these active recovery strategies made a huge difference. We ran and raced so many marathon stages over the course of this event that I became very in tune with how my body was responding. And if I skipped a day, for example, with the foam roller, I definitely felt tighter the next day, and it for sure impeded my performance. There was some degree of social stress throughout the race, and tensions between some runners caused additional complications and inhibited performance. 2 runners decided the social stress was too much after 2 to 3 weeks and opted to leave the official race to continue their cross-country run on their own terms. 2 further runners left the race due to family and work-related stress or obligations. And amazingly, over the 4.5 months of running over a marathon per day, only 1 runner of the 12 that started retired due to injury. By the end of the race, we'd grown quite close as a group. As you can see in some of these pictures here, the top picture and the rightmost picture were taken from our final day of the race, when most of us decided to run the stage together at the same pace. And in fact, just speaking to the strength of the bonds we formed, 2 of our research assistants who met for the first time during the race actually started dating during the race and are now engaged to be married this October, which is a really incredible, I think, thing for all of us to now get to be a part of. So after the finish of the race in June 2015, we set to work analyzing the data. And in full disclosure, I took a new position focused more on education and coaching than research at that time. And so I leaned a little more heavily on my colleagues at this stage to crunch the numbers and write up the results. But this year was the first paper published from the data collected during the race across USA, led by my colleague, Dr. Kara Okabach. Dr. Okabach looked at body composition and heart rate data across the race and found that far from wasting away, the runner's performance has actually improved over the course of the race, suggesting successful adaptation to their experienced stress. You can see from the data in figure 1 on the left of speed versus time over the course of the run, that 2 runners, pictured at the top, the 2 lines at the top, increased speed over the first 3 months before declining to just above baseline at the finish, whereas the remainder of the field, running speed increased steadily throughout the run. For some context, I can tell you that these 2 runners at the top, these 2 lines up here, those that did not increase speed throughout the race, that these 2 runners were racing each other every day in every stage. And by month 3, runner number 6, the one pictured at the top with the highest speed, had accumulated a large enough lead that runner number 3 knew the race, such as it was effectively over, and the 2 consciously decided to ease their competition over the remaining stages. But as you can also see from the data in figure 2 on the right, on average, as speed increased throughout the race for most runners, our mean submaximal heart rate decreased, suggesting the runner's physiology was adapting successfully to the stress. They were becoming stronger, more efficient runners. So if there's an upper limit to human endurance and adaptation, these data appear to show that the runners, or that these runners anyway, didn't reach it with a marathon nearly every day for 4.5 months. The second major paper to come out of the Race Across USA data was spearheaded by Herman Ponzer, his student Caitlin Thurber, and colleagues Laura Dugas and Kara Okabach. Doctors Thurber and Ponzer used the doubly labeled water technique to quantify total energy expenditure by the runners at the beginning, midpoint, and finish of the Race Across USA. But the key insight came when they tried to put our metabolic adaptations in some context. The runners burned an average 5,500 to 6,000 calories per day during the Race Across USA. And Thurber and Ponzer then asked whether this was more or less than we would expect, given the amount that we were running. Pulling together a variety of data from energetic studies of polar exploration, endurance sports, and pregnancy, a pretty amazing relationship emerged, which we can see in figure 1B in the middle here. The shorter duration events, pictured on the left, this really steep part of the curve, allowed a greater metabolic scope. Basically, the shorter the duration of the event, the greater the energetic burn rate, is defined as a multiple of the athlete's basal metabolic rate. But the longer the events got, the lower the metabolic scope was found to be. So the intensity of energetic burn was reduced the longer the event went on. Now, this wasn't too surprising, but the curve seemed to quickly flatten out for events that continued beyond a few days' duration. And whether cycling, trekking, or running, there appeared to be an upper limit to sustainable effort that fell at around 2.5 times the basal metabolic rate. Kind of pictured here as this dotted line at the bottom of the curve. Perhaps not so coincidentally, 2.5 times basal metabolic rate is the approximate metabolic scope of pregnant and lactating mothers as well. So the next question was why? Like, what is defining this sustainable upper limit of metabolic activity? Overfeeding studies seem to suggest that 2.5 times basal metabolic rate is also a sustainable upper limit to the amount of energy humans are willing or able to ingest and absorb, which we can see in figure A on the left here. 2.5 times BMR seem to be the average intake in these overfeeding studies, with very few exceptions, regardless of the duration of time. The red squares in figure B on the right showed that endurance athletes that burned more than 2.5 times their basal metabolic rate unanimously lost weight, implying that they could not absorb more than 2.5 times the basal metabolic rate worth of energy to sustain that output. So the conclusion from Dr. Thurber's analysis seemed to be that there is an upper limit, or seems to be an upper limit to energetic expenditure, about 2.5 times basal metabolic rate, and that upper limit is defined by our ability to absorb enough energy to facilitate it. So then why is 2.5 times the basal metabolic rate the upper limit for energetic absorption? Seems kind of like a random number. Well, this may very well have been driven by the energetic demands during pregnancy, which is, I think, is a really interesting finding, that the limits of sustainable endurance may be defined by demands of pregnant or lactating mothers. So apart from the scientific insights of the Race Across USA, I thought I'd share just a few anecdotal reflections. The first is that obviously stress can be positive. Too often in society, we view stress as a negative to be avoided. And we certainly experienced a variety of mental and physical stresses throughout the Race Across USA. But I think I can speak for all the runners when I say we emerged stronger and more resilient and wouldn't trade that experience for the world. The second is that perception is malleable. I remember running through the Mojave Desert in 2 distinctly different mental states early in the race. One in a very positive and upbeat mood, and a second day in a very fatigued and stressed state. My perception of that space, of the desert around me, was dramatically different between those 2 days, despite objectively representing the same landscape of sand and sun. From that point on, I began consciously working to create a positive and cultivate a positive frame around each day and experience. Because if perception was malleable, I wanted to do my best to make it positive. Third, we absorb the energy around us. Every morning we had about a 5 or 50 even minute drive to our starting line for the day. These minutes in the car included both dance parties and disgruntled bickering. I often found thereafter my entire run was heavily influenced by the tone of our morning drive. Mornings with dance parties frequently led to fast and fun runs. Morning drives with a predominantly negative affect frequently led to slower and more labored runs. So if we absorb the energy around us, we also have a choice to surround ourselves to the extent possible with positive energy that will set us up for success. Finally, fixating on variables we can't control prevents us from adapting to them. My goal throughout the Race Across USA was to complete each day, each stage as fast as I could without hindering my ability to do the same the next day. The first 2 weeks involved a lot of inflammation as our legs adapted to the early stresses, but getting up and completing another 26.2 or more miles on swollen legs the next day was a requirement to stay in the race. We didn't have the option to run a shorter distance to let ourselves heal. So instead, we all focused on what we could control. We used compression socks and sleeves. We used a judicious amount of anti-inflammatory medicine, so ibuprofen. We used ice and elevation, and we slowed down when our bodies were clearly struggling under the stress. Those behavioral and technological adaptations were key to facilitating successful biological adaptation. Following the incredible personal experience I had in the Race Across USA, I almost immediately began thinking about what might come next. And I have to credit a few of the guys in that Race Across USA for inspiring me to think differently and more confidently embark down a road not yet traveled. The Race Across USA showed me that when it comes to the limits of human endurance, there are none. Over the course of weeks or months, the human body can behave very much like a machine. Now, that machine has tolerances and limits, but so long as you fuel the machine and keep all the components within those stress limits, the body can keep going. But that 3,000-mile effort was buoyed by a large safety net and network of social and psychological support. I was really curious how the endurance experience would differ under conditions of isolation. For example, it's easier to get up and do work day after day when you know 11 other people are right there with you. It's a lot harder to get up and do the work when you're only accountable to yourself and no one will know whether you decided to sleep in and just hang out for the day. So I began planning for what would become a solo and unsupported row across the North Atlantic Ocean. While all my ultra endurance adventures to date had been running challenges, I had rowed competitively in college and had been coaching high school and collegiate rowing for about 10 years. So this seemed like a wonderful way to switch gears on one level, but also dive deeper into the psychology and physiology of ultra endurance. Unfortunately, another lesson I learned from the Race Across USA is that funding for science is too competitive right now to really support projects with little track record of publication and the prospect of a very small sample size. So given this particular adventure was looking at a sample size of 1, I wasn't overly optimistic. But I did manage to convince Dr. Kevin Alschuler of the University of Washington School of Medicine, who was also a collaborator on our Race Across the US project. He'd also published some previous work on the psychology of ultramarathon runners, and he became interested in getting involved in the race, in the row across the North Atlantic. So I spent 3 years preparing specifically for this row. Year 1 was defined by a voracious amount of reading about those who had rowed across an ocean before and or sailed across the open ocean. And that first year was really all about defining the anticipated challenges of rowing solo and unsupported across the North Atlantic. I knew those challenges would include a very large volume of activity, would involve the psychology of isolation, safety, obviously a huge concern, navigation. I would have to navigate my way from A to B without the benefit of really any landmarks. In the North Atlantic, it's very foggy and cloudy, very challenging to use the stars to navigate by. So that was something I had to explore a little more. I'd have to come up with the permits and figure out customs requirements. And the biggest challenge of all, the funding. This would be a very expensive underpinning adventure. And it took me a long while to figure out how I was going to make the funding work. The second year was all about preparation, was all about securing that financing, identifying a boat builder, getting the boat built. And then that third year was largely very specific focus training in the boat on some large bodies of water, including Lake Michigan. This year was the boat. The boat I named Lucille after my grandmother, which was about 20 feet long, about 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide. You can see from this picture, the front third of the boat up here is an enclosed cabin. It was watertight and airtight, but it had a vent that could be opened to allow air exchange. And this allowed me to sleep safely, if not comfortably, in rough weather. The middle third of the boat was an open rowing deck with a number of watertight storage compartments filled with food. The back third, a small cabin used for an autopilot, which would help automatically keep the boat on heading while I rowed, so it would automatically steer, a backup desalinator, and some additional storage. I also had 3 solar panels on the boat for power, to power the electronics, which included a GPS, VHF radio, an emergency beacon, radar enhancer, some data monitors, and a variety of other pieces of safety equipment. The original plan was that I would record some psychological inventory every 24 hours of the row, and I would record those responses on a laptop that I carried on board. Unfortunately, as luck would have it, my computer took on water 5 days into the row, frying the computer, and I had to submit the remaining daily inventories to Dr. Alschuler via satellite phone. But each inventory included both a series of quantitative questions, ratings, I should say, from 0 to 10, 0 meaning least, never or not, 10 being most or always, and then 2 or 3 qualitative open-ended questions that allowed me to reflect on the past 24 hours experience and put a little more color on that daily experience that the quantitative inventory alone could not. So this is a little short video clip of the harbor in St. John's, Newfoundland, where I set out from. So I arrived in St. John's on July 16th in 2018, and within a day or so, we'd identified this harbor in Kitty Vitty where I would launch from. My good friend was a good friend from college was with me. He would serve as my one-man crew in Newfoundland, helping me acquire last-minute supplies, which turned out to be incredibly valuable, as we discovered very early on that my primary desalinator, which was an essential bit of equipment responsible for turning salt water into drinkable water, that it wasn't working properly as soon as we arrived. And after a week of attempted repairs, phone calls to the manufacturer for the desalinator and pints at the Kitty Vitty Brewing Company, I finally overnighted a new desalinator, had it installed, and was ready to go. So in this video clip, you can see pretty typical rowing conditions for the North Atlantic. You can see it's very foggy. There's a lot of water suspended in the air, and that made rowing conditions a little bit colder and a little more damp throughout the row than than I might have expected. My daily schedule involved getting up around 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning. And when I say get up around 6:30, 7, I mean stop trying to sleep around 6:30 or 7. It was often very difficult to get good sleep in the cabin, as the boat was often getting barraged around by waves that were very loud as they would break against the hull. I'd fix myself some granola and then start rowing by 8 o'clock. I would row until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so it's about 5 hours, taking 1 to 5 minute break for water every 30 minutes, or about 5 to 10 minute break every hour for some caloric intake to stretch out, or to change some music that I might have had playing on the stereo. At 1 o'clock, I'd have lunch of a rehydrated meal. I would then get back to rowing until around 8 p.m. with the same schedule as the morning, breaks every 30 minutes for water, every hour for a little more food. And then after 8 o'clock, I would fix another dinner of a rehydrated meal, and then complete the psychological inventory, maybe fire off a message to loved ones via satellite phone, and then get to sleep. The desalinator that I had overnighted worked great for about 24 hours, but then unfortunately died, just as the previous one had. Thankfully, I had an emergency backup desalinator, which you can see pictured here, but this backup desalinator required manual pumping in order to generate clean, potable water. It wasn't very fast. About 100 pumps of this desalinator yielded 1 cup of water, which meant in order to generate enough water to rehydrate my meals and to drink each day, that I spent about 1 to 2 hours pumping the desalinator. And you can also get a little bit of a sense from this clip here that being on such a small boat on the ocean felt a little bit like being in a washing machine. There was a lot of getting kind of bobbed around, but for the most part, I got used to that. So this is a map of the route that I took across the North Atlantic, from Newfoundland on the left to England, the Scilly Isles of England on the right. The blue line represents the course I actually took, and each of these X's represents where some problem, some novel stress was introduced into the row. About 24 hours in, as I said, the primary desalinator died. About 5 days into the row, my cabin took on some water while I was asleep because I had left the vent open. And when the boat was rolled over by a big wave, water came pouring into the cabin and fried out the electronics on that computer. Several days later, I was in a pretty big storm, which broke the centerboard on the boat, which helped the boat maintain a relatively straight course in adverse winds. My autopilot also broke then about 10 days into the trip. So from there on, it was manual steering. Shortly thereafter, I received word that a hurricane, Hurricane Chris, was on its way. How I dealt with those stresses, boy, that's a whole other story. But let me just say, those next several days were incredibly stressful. Thankfully, by the time Hurricane Chris reached my part of the North Atlantic, it had significantly weakened to the point where I only was facing about 45-mile-an-hour winds and 17-foot waves, which thankfully the boat was able to manage without too much difficulty. About halfway across, a device on board that informs me if I'm about to be run over by a container ship. It's a pretty key bit of safety equipment. That died. And then moving on to the trip, my primary GPS died, my stereo went on the fritz, my secondary GPS died, the data monitors went on the fritz. I mean, it was really one stress after another, but I really had to adopt the mindset that once it's gone, once that bit of equipment is gone, there's nothing I can do about it, it's gone. And I just have to imagine how I'm going to keep on given the equipment that I do have available to me. So despite all the stresses, there were also a number of really surreal, magical moments like this picture here. You know, I think I can count on one hand the number of days I experienced that were relatively cloud-free, where I could see, you know, a beautiful sky and the sun. Another morning, I woke up to this kind of wonderful sight of all these, you know, millions of copepods swimming around my boat. And even though I didn't see many other whales or ships on my trip, they really made me feel like I wasn't out there alone. And you know, in addition, obviously, to the millions of copepods, there were trillions and trillions of microbes that I couldn't see with the naked eye that I knew were also, let's say, supporting my journey. So finally, after 38 days and some change, with an amount of amazing luck and coincidence, I finally made it into this really beautiful harbor alongside what you can see pictured here is called a gig boat. And I found the juxtaposition of me arriving in port with this brand new carbon fiber shell alongside this 100-year-old wooden boat was just a really wonderful, I don't know, it was a wonderful experience. And you can see in the picture in the upper right here, I don't know how they pulled it off, but I managed to arrive somehow to some degree of fanfare with flares and fireworks and cannons and music. It was a really special moment for sure. So after I finished, I sent all the psychological inventories off to Dr. Alschuler, and that's when he and his team set to work crunching all the numbers. For a variety of reasons, we chose that I would effectively remove myself from the authorship of this particular paper and play no role in the data analysis and the results. But looking at some of the published results here, you can see these were some summary statistics from that quantitative inventory. And you can see here that average pain interference, and loneliness were experienced with the least frequency and intensity, whereas every other emotional affect ranged from very low to very high at some point on the expedition. So of all these inventory items, you can see the minimum value 0 or close to 0, the maximum reported value, with a few exceptions, very high, right? So at some point along the journey, I experienced a pretty wide range of emotional experience. Now, going beyond this, I'd say it's a little awkward diving into the details of someone else's psychological analysis of oneself. So with respect to the remainder of their analysis, I'll just direct you to Dr. Alschuler's paper if you're interested in reading more. So a few final kind of reflections and personal lessons that I took from this particular experience. One, I think the idea of crazy is subjective. And I think crazy is probably a lot less crazy than we think. You know, this is a label that I was branded with a lot, both throughout the race across USA and leading up to the row across the North Atlantic. And I can understand where the comment was coming from, but I do think that the more we learn and experience, the more opportunity we see in big, audacious things that others can't perhaps wrap their head around. And so from that perspective, crazy is perhaps just a label used by those lacking sufficient imagination. Second, lesson is that the strength we seek is layered within, and the number of layers truly is infinite. This is a quote I came across several years ago, and I'm forgetting who to attribute this to, but I think it's such a powerful one. We face a lot of stresses and challenges in life, and very often the strength we need to get through those challenges is layered within us. But it requires sometimes peeling back a number of layers to get down to the strength we need to get through that particular challenge. Third, technology can buffer isolation to an extent. Having my satellite phone with me allowed me to keep in touch in almost real time with friends and family back home. And that really helps me feel like I was connected to community, even though I was out there, the only human in sight. And finally, I found that throughout my row that logic and vigilance were far more important than emotion. It truly felt like survival necessitated a focus on variables that were under my control and maintaining near constant vigilance throughout the row itself. After the finish, it seemed to take a few days to really feel again, as much as I would like to say that reaching the finish and seeing my parents and my now wife there at the finish waiting for me, that it was a truly emotional moment. But it wasn't. I really felt numb, emotionally numb in that moment. And it took a few days for those feels to really come back on board. So I'd just like to wrap up with a few kind of concluding thoughts on like how I think about challenges, how I think about resilience, how we might prepare for challenges in our futures, even the challenges that we can't anticipate. Despite the historical and political baggage of this quote by Donald Rumsfeld, I love it for a variety of reasons. And I think there are clear parallels between this quote and how I think about ultra-endurance challenges and perhaps novel challenges in general. Rumsfeld in 2002 said, "As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns." And that is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know that we don't know. So here I think of known knowns as anticipated challenges that we are currently prepared for, right? The challenges we know are coming and we're already prepared to meet them. Known unknowns, I think, correspond to anticipated challenges that we are currently unprepared for. Right? These challenges may require new knowledge, new skills, credentials, greater fitness, but we can work systematically to prepare for these challenges, right? Going through cycles of mild to moderate stress, followed by recovery, in other words, training, we can prepare for these unknowns. And they often involve transforming oneself into the kind of person capable of meeting these challenges and thereby move them into the previous category of known knowns, right? the more we work towards preparing for known unknowns, the more they become known knowns. And finally, there's the unknown unknowns category, right? These I see as unanticipated challenges that we are unprepared for. I think these are a little trickier. Like, how do you prepare for a challenge you don't know that you're going to face? I think these type of challenges require active problem-solving skills and resilience. From my experience, again, I don't have research to back this up. I'm just speaking from my experience. I think problem solving and resilience are really built from experience, right? The toolkit of skills necessary to remain calm, focused, and active in the face of novel stressors. That's what we built with experience, right? And over the course of the race across USA and the North Atlantic solo row, I certainly experienced a lot of known challenges, anticipated challenges, but I also, and the other runners also, experienced a lot of unanticipated challenges that we had to problem solve in real time. And I think that really differentiated those runners that were able to successfully navigate that race across USA and my experience in the North Atlantic as well. Now, one of the tricks is we begin preparing for a significant challenge of our future is identifying the knowns from the unknowns, right? The anticipated challenges that we're prepared for, the anticipated challenges we're not prepared for, and the unanticipated challenges. And I think that process requires a pretty high degree, let's say, of self-awareness and what Stephen Fleming called metacognitive sensitivity. This is a book I just started reading, and I'm really a big fan and would highly recommend taking a look. Fleming's book, Know Thyself, The Science of Self-Awareness, speaks of metacognitive sensitivity as an ability to accurately assess one's abilities and the gap between current knowledge, skills, fitness, and what will be required for the challenge ahead. I think it's necessary to prepare for the challenges one might conceivably anticipate are coming. But then once you've prepared for the known unknowns, having resilience is key to successfully navigating the oncoming stress that will arrive with all those unknown unknowns that will unfold throughout the challenge that you're experiencing. And resilience may be a function, I think, of non-specific stress adaptation experiences. So I think experience with mild to moderate stress and successful adaptation leads to skills and knowledge and confidence, which facilitate the ability to navigate the unanticipated challenges which we all face, not just in running marathons or going to graduate school, but that we all face throughout life. For example, my wife is currently pregnant with our first child, and I know there are lots of challenges for us ahead. Many of those challenges are known, and I can anticipate them and to some extent prepare, but many will be unknown unknowns, challenges we can't anticipate because they're going to be unique to our family. And the world that we're living in, say 10 years from now, will be different from the one we're living in today. But I'm confident that the problem solving and coping skills I've begun to develop in these adventures will allow me to better navigate the unknown and unknowable waters of fatherhood with greater resilience than if I'd not had these experiences. So if you were to ask me how long it took me to prepare for the race across USA or the North Atlantic solo row, the most honest answer I can give is my whole life, right? I've accumulated a lot of experiences of stress and adaptation, which have allowed me to develop the skills to manage the unknown unknowns that arose during each of these big experiences, race across USA and the North Atlantic solo row. So I think with that, I'll just issue my sincerest thanks to Purdue University for funding a lot of this research, for the Seven Hills School, where I'm currently employed, that have been incredibly supportive of time to continue pursuing these adventures. Sincere thanks to my colleagues, Herman Ponzer, Kara Okabat, Caitlin Thurber, Lara Dugas, Kevin Alschuler, our research assistants, Andrea Zukora, Samantha Upton, Garrett Quathermer, and Darren and Sandy Van Soy, who are our race directors and organizers for Race Across the USA. I can't thank them enough for their tireless work in organizing that race and making sure it truly went off without a hitch. So I think with that, I'll stop and open the floor for questions and answers.
Thanks, Bryce, for sharing your incredible experience. Your question, like, what are the limits of human endurance? Obviously, you have no limit. And not even wearing gloves while crossing the Atlantic rowing? You are incredible, absolutely fascinating. Let's give Bryce a very well-deserved virtual round of applause. And now we will proceed with the question and answers. And I will start myself. During the 3100 race across the USA, I found very interesting that the fastest runner could not keep improving speed, and none of the other runners were able to keep up with him. Do you think that there is a limit of preparation, or because this is a long, I mean, this is not a very, 10 minutes run, who can be faster? And you guys were very well prepared. He got a peak and then he decreased, and nobody else was able to catch up with him.
Yeah. My read of that is, I think, obviously there's variation in the degree of preparation that the runners took before beginning the race. I think some runners came in to the race in a little better fitness, right? One thing I didn't explicitly share is that the runners ranged in age from about 30 years old to over 70 years old. So we had some really old, over 60 years old. So we had some young and some really old runners. So obviously you might not expect a 65-year-old runner to be able to keep up with a 30-year-old athlete at their prime. So I think what we're seeing with those first two runners is not necessarily a physiological limit, but rather one runner that was simply better prepared, stronger, fitter, was able to run a faster marathon on any given day than the second runner, and recover fast enough to continue. I would say, again, just from personal experience and knowing who these runners are, I think what differentiated that first runner from the others is he had an incredible ability to recover. Like, he recovered incredibly quickly. He might experience an injury on one day that would leave him almost crippled, like twist an ankle severely, and the next day be back to almost 100%. So I think that I think explained that difference maybe more than any inherent or ultimate limit.
Yeah, thanks. You said also that at the end of your experience, you feel numb. How difficult is to adjust back to a regular life?
It was hard, but thankfully I found that even after I finished, my brain was maintaining like a long to-do list of just everything I had to do. I was in the fortunate position to have set a new world record with that row. And so there were a number of journalists that were wanting to speak with me, but I also had to navigate expectations from customs agents. I needed to fill out some paperwork right away. I needed to phone this particular agency. I needed to transport the boat to this other agency to get it inspected, et cetera, et cetera. So even after the finish, it felt like all the things and the responsibilities that I had were still there. And I felt really weighed down by all those responsibilities. It was only, I think, once those responsibilities started to kind of be taken care of, be taken off my shoulders, that it finally felt like I could let my hair down, so to speak.
Yeah. Have you found that your ability to adapt now applies to everything that comes to you and your everyday life? Did you adapt quicker and wiser?
I do. I mean, I think the experiences I've had have given me, have helped me develop the skills to problem solve, and helped me develop a resilience to stress. Yeah, and I also think it's helped me develop kind of a mental framework for kind of living life in a way that's a little more positive and optimistic, that I also think helps psychologically navigate stressful events, right? To fixate on variables I can control rather than, become overwhelmed or enamored by variables I can't control.
Yeah. A question from Lauren. Can you share some information on the quantity and quality of sleep during the race, and what, if any, role you think sleep had on recovery and adaptation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really important. One decision I made very early on in my preparation for the row was to follow a very different row and sleep schedule that a lot of open water ocean rowers follow. One thing I read kind of over and over again in the books and the articles that were written about ocean rowing is that a lot of rowers were following a 2 hours of work and 2 hours of rest cycle. And they would maintain that 2 hours on, 2 hours off cycle through the day, through the night. So at most, they were only getting maybe an hour and a half of sleep at a time. And I just knew that wasn't going to be sufficient to really enter into some of the REM, the really recuperative REM cycles of sleep that are so important for recovery and adaptation. So for me, it was really important to follow what effectively became kind of 12 hours on and 12 hours off. So I would try to accumulate as many miles behind the oars as I could between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. But then at 8 p.m., I was done, regardless of like how far I had gotten or how far I had not gotten, with a couple exceptions. But starting at 8 p.m., that was the time to focus on recovery and to try to get as much sleep as I could. Now, that sleep was not uninterrupted. I would try to start going to bed, usually around 9 o'clock after I'd finished dinner. And often I was so exhausted, I would fall asleep right immediately. But the boat is kind of rocking, and I would get used to the gentle, predictable rocking, but every now and then the boat would get hit by a rogue wave that would thunder throughout the cabin in terms of noise, extremely loud. And it felt a bit like getting hit by a car at low speeds, like a low-speed car crash. That's kind of how it felt inside the cabin when getting hit by a lot of these waves. So those would often wake me up in the middle of the night, and then I, kind of roll over and go back to sleep. I will say, after my autopilot broke about 10 days in, I frequently woke up purposely in the middle of the night to check my course and whether the boat was moving still along the course I was expecting, whether the wind was still blowing it more or less in the direction, given the way I had set the rudder or not. And if the wind had changed, if the currents had changed, then I would reset the rudder in a way that would keep the boat back on track. And so usually every 2 hours or so through the night, I would wake up and check my course and adjust if necessary. So, I would try to sleep maybe 10 hours a night, but, it was in probably 2 hour spurts and highly interrupted.
Yeah, and I think this is in continuation with how did you not get lost at sea?
Thankfully, I had a GPS with me. I had a really nice GPS that was kind of built into the electronic panel of the boat. And it would track my location along with a map of where I started, where I was going, and kind of like the most ideal, like the fastest course from A to B. And so at any given moment, I could look at my position on that navigation screen and see, am I on course, am I off course? If I deviated from course, I could adjust the rudder to bring myself back on course. Now, at one point on the row, that primary GPS died. And I needed to rely on a handheld like Garmin GPS where I was largely just looking at the latitude and longitude and plotting that latitude and longitude on a physical paper map and plotting my course that way. But I had several backup means of navigation. I had the primary GPS, I had this handheld, my wristwatch was also had a GPS function on it. So my wristwatch would give me the latitude and longitude if I needed it. So there was a lot of redundancy I had built into those most critical pieces of safety equipment. It was similar for the emergency beacons. I had a backup. I had one main emergency beacon, but then I had a backup personal emergency beacon that would be on my life jacket at all times. I had two other mechanisms of broadcasting that I needed help. So I think robusticity of safety protocols necessitate a lot of redundancy.
Ramina wants to know, what was your biggest aha moment during run and solo row as a runner, rower, as a scientist?
Oh boy, that's a big question, but a good one. I think one aha moment of sorts, on the run across the US, I would say there were several. I mean, the first probably came about 2.5 weeks into the run. The first several days, I think everyone was so excited to be out there finally doing it that I don't think we really felt the stress that our bodies were beginning to really absorb. It wasn't until maybe day 4 or 5 that I think inflammation really started to rear its head for a lot of us. But by halfway through the second week, I felt like my inflammation and pain and discomfort had really peaked and was starting to subside. And like, as that inflammation and pain was getting worse, I mean, that really racked, I think, my confidence. Like, is it just going to continue to get worse? Like, am I doing the right things to manage this? And once that inflammation started to get better, and I felt my body was successfully adapting to the stress, I think that was really a big moment. But I still held out that I knew there was likely going to be a lot of unanticipated challenges in the weeks ahead. And so I refused to get overly confident at that stage. I think about 2/3 of the way through that run across the US, I felt like I had experienced most of the challenges that race was going to provide. So barring, some emergency, we had seen a lot of different types of weather. We'd experienced a lot of different types of injuries and pre-injuries, and I had learned how to manage all of those. So that was a pretty, I think, significant moment, at least in my confidence, that I felt like, okay, I think I'm going to be able to finish this thing. In terms of the row across the Atlantic, I think getting through that hurricane was a big aha moment. Like, I felt like after I had successfully managed 17-foot waves and 45-mile-an-hour winds, that might be the worst that I was going to experience. And again, a little sigh of relief that, okay, if I can manage those stresses, then I think I'll be able to manage whatever comes next.
Were you afraid? Did you get some moment that you thought that you will not make it?
No, I don't think I allowed myself that feeling of, I don't think I'm going to make it, or fear exactly. I felt very high degrees of anxiety, like really, really high degrees of anxiety. Just in knowing I have this huge challenge coming. It might be the hurricane. It might be, my weather forecast might be that I'm going to experience a really weird combination of currents and wind direction, wind strength, and wave direction and wave size. And I didn't quite know how I or the boat were going to navigate that weird combination of waves and wind and currents, etc. But often I would get those forecasts a few days before I would actually have to navigate them. And that gave me some time to problem solve and figure out how I was going to do it. So often when I get the forecast and I saw what was coming, there was an oh shit moment. I don't know what I'm going to do. And then, as time went on, and my head started to congeal around a solution, the anxiety came back down, and then I'd have to face the problem, whether I was fully prepared for it or not, get through the problem, and then this feeling of, near euphoria of being out the other side.
But I think this is a very fascinating lesson for all of us. And the fact probably you're wired in the brain because you are alone in the middle of the ocean in a tiny little nothing. You are in the middle of the hurricane and you are not scared, but your brain is like, how can I solve the problem? And I think that mindset is what makes people the difference of we are solving the problem or we are panicking and crash. And I mean, because if you didn't get scared in that situation, you are unstoppable. And I think we should be learning, this is an amazing lesson, how when we go through a difficult situation or problem, how we can get out of that situation instead of freaking out. I think this is an incredible.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do think the more stressful experiences we have in our life, I think that that may buffer us from the experiences of novel stressors that we experience like throughout our lives, right? Like if you've never experienced real stress before, the first time you experience it, it's going to be very hard to not think very emotionally about what you're experiencing and be overwhelmed by it. But I think the more experiences we accumulate, embodying stress and successfully adapting to them, the easier I think it becomes to look at that stressor a little more objectively and think, all right, what can I control? What can I not control? And what kind of plan can I put together to get through this successfully?
Excellent. Glenn wants to know, after your periods of extreme dedication and control, how do you relax and have fun nowadays?
I don't know. I do. I think, I don't know if this is, it's certainly not unique to me. It's certainly not unique to my generation. But, the group of guys that I went to college with, I rowed competitively in college. And I think our team had a culture that really embraced this kind of work hard, play hard kind of mentality. That if you work hard throughout the day and you're productive and you accomplish a lot, then you've earned the right to relax hard at the end of the day. And so while I certainly pay a lot of attention to my training and to nutrition, I also really enjoy whiskey, for example, in moderation. So, I think all things in moderation, including moderation from time to time.
I think this is a little bit related to what you just said. Elisa wants to know that you mentioned that during the initial systems malfunctions of the row, it was very stressful and is a whole other story, while your frustration numbers appear to have been relatively low. How did you manage to avoid an emotional meltdown during this first stressful period, which appeared to have been before you have devised your emotional game plan? Essentially, what kept you from quitting?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think certainly the entire row was a learning process. I was learning lessons every day of that row that made me stronger for the challenges I would face later on. But I also wasn't starting the row from scratch without an emotional toolkit for managing stress. I think my race across the US helped me develop a toolkit for managing stress. And the countless experiences I had had in marathons, ultra endurance events, and getting through college and grad school, et cetera. Like all of those experiences build, I think, skills for managing stress. How did I just not quit? Maybe because it wasn't really an option. Once you kind of thrust yourself out there into the open water, I was following trade winds that were prevailing winds from west to east, from North America to Europe. It would have been nearly impossible for me to turn the boat around and go backwards. So the fastest and safest way to get to safety was just to keep going.
Incredible. Lauren, how do you think about resilience in relation to your teaching and student learning in your current position at the Seven Hills School?
Yeah. One thing is that, I try to give my students opportunities to experience mild and moderate stress, hopefully not severe stress, in my classroom, and to have the opportunity to adapt successfully to it and develop the confidence that comes from that. I try not to spell out to my students too clearly what they need to know and how they need to study to get there. I think their own journey through our curriculum is going to be unique to their past experiences. And I want them to kind of define that journey for themselves. And again, develop the skills and confidence and resilience that come from facing challenges on their own terms. Now, I see myself as a coach and a guide and a mentor and a teacher to help them navigate that process when they need help. But I think, often students ask for help when they want it, not when they need it. And so I think that's a challenging balance, I think, as an educator, is to provide them all the help that they need, but not necessarily all the help that they want, so that they have to navigate that process themselves to develop those skills and develop that resilience.
And I think that the training that you put yourself on, this is a little bit what the Navy SEALs goes through. I mean, they go impossible tasks to be able to make the possible. And this is exactly what you are doing by yourself, your self-training. Vieira, how did you deal with doubts or self-doubt? Or did you have none?
I had a lot of doubts, and I manage doubts every day. And that's, I think, regardless of what we collectively have done in the past, I think, just as the body is capable of becoming fitter and more adaptive for a set of challenges, if we don't continue to stress the body to maintain our preparedness for those challenges, we lose that preparedness. For example, just this summer, it's just like the onset of summer in so many places, it's gotten pretty warm here in Cincinnati pretty quickly. And it's been a little while since I've done a lot of running, and I tried to start kind of getting back into the routine. And in these hot days, going out and running for even just 3 miles, I have found really hard. 3 miles or 5 miles. And as I'm running, 3 miles, 5 miles, whatever, I have a lot of self-doubts in my head. Like, how are you this unfit, Bryce? Come on, what are you doing? And you just have to keep at it. I don't know. I just think I try to focus on where I want to get, what goals I have for myself. And that's why, I titled this talk, a goal-oriented journey towards adaptation. Because I think goals are really, really important. And goals help, I think, pull us through those phases of self-doubt. You say, look, I want to become the kind of athlete who can run a 5K. I want to become the kind of athlete who can run a marathon. I want to, whatever. And then you put a plan in place to transform yourself into that. And, sometimes we experience things along that path that question whether the path that we're on, the program that we created, the training plan, whatever, whether that's really appropriate. Did we think too highly of our fitness our current fitness when we put that together? And we need to, make some changes to that plan along the way. But as long as we stay fixated on that goal of where we want to get, I think ultimately we keep making progress. And as we see ourselves making progress, it's easier to quiet the self-doubt.
I think Taylor wants to follow your steps because he's asking you what volume of training is required to safely complete a 100-mile race. I struggle to sustainably push past 30 miles.
Yeah, 2 things. I would say the execution of the race, let's say slow down. Whatever the distance is, for anyone that is feeling they're having a hard time getting beyond a certain distance, maybe someone who has run a 5K before, but they have goals to run the next neighborhood 10K. First tip is just go slower, add walking breaks if you need to. that's totally okay, right? Focus on just completing the distance. The second, in terms of volume of training for a 100-miler, I think it's going to be a little bit variable. If you don't have any past experience of running 100-milers, I think it's going to be pretty hard to do on less than 60 miles a week. That's 60 miles per week. In terms of how far should you be running on any given training run in building up for 100 miles, I don't think you need to run more than 20 miles at once. But what I would recommend is stacking those 20-mile runs back to back, and maybe even back to back to back. So you might run a 20-mile run on Saturday, and then before your body has fully recovered from that run, you run another 20 miles on Sunday. And then, maybe you really want to take, then maybe another beyond that anyway. But I think stacking those long runs is one real key to training for ultramarathon distances.
Varun wants to, do you have any future plans for an ultra endurance challenge? The baby that is coming.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I have some ideas, some things I'd love to do, but they're going to be dependent on a number of things that I just, I'm hoping will line up, but we'll see. But yeah, the challenge I know for sure that's on its way is fatherhood. So I think that's the one I'm focused on right now.
And Ramina, what would be the advice recommendation to yourself if you have to repeat it all again? What is the next challenge?
If I had to go back and do the race across the US again, I think I would prepare exactly how I prepared the first time. Now it's been about 6 years since I completed that, so my memory isn't quite as fresh about how I felt. I remember my confidence being very low at the beginning of the race, like on day one, feeling like I hadn't done enough, that too many, like that organizing the research had compromised my physical training, and that, I hadn't really been able to organize either the research or my physical training as well as I would have liked. So my confidence is really low, but I think over the next couple of weeks, everything played out. And the first couple of weeks ended up being training for the rest of the event. So I don't think I would change anything there. I might change what I did with the row across the Atlantic. I mean, there's so many things I couldn't have prepared for. Experience handling that boat out in the open water is very hard to come by. It's very hard to rehearse that. And so I think knowing what I know now, I have a better sense of how the boat handles. I have a better sense of navigation. I have a better sense of what systems died and how to prevent them from dying the next time. So I think that if I were to do that again, I think it would be, I'd be making some of those modifications.
The last question, how do you know, is Janet, how do you know when to persevere and keep going towards your goal, or when to reevaluate and change course?
Boy, that's the hardest. That I think is the hardest question of all. When to just keep your head down and persevere, and when to say it's too much. To identify, for example, the kind of fatigue and discomfort that is normal in a 50 or 100-mile race versus the discomfort that is a sign of an injury coming on. Part of that just comes with experience. And okay, I felt this before, this is the context I felt that before, and this is how that transpired. I got an injury that knocked me out of that race, or I felt this before and I pushed through and it didn't get any worse. So that's maybe a sign that it was just fatigue, and that I won't risk injury, or I probably won't risk injury if I just push through. That's a really hard one. I think it also takes a lot of that metacognitive sensitivity that I mentioned too, like knowing your current state and the gap between where you are and where you'd like to be, and to assess that fairly requires a lot of introspection, I think.
So Bryce, thank you very much for the fascinating and inspirational presentation. We are looking forward to hear about your future race, and you're always invited to our Fulbright speaker series to share your incredible adventures, because you are absolutely an inspiration. I also want to thank the San Diego chapter of the Fulbright Association and the University of California, San Diego Global Education, especially to David Gianni, for making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to you all for attending the webinar. We will send you a link with the recording and let you know about our next Fulbright speaker series. Be safe. Thanks for joining us. And bye-bye, everybody. Bye, Bryce.
Thank you so much.